Hello, algebra friends. We are on the second portion of our statistics unit, which will focus on categorical data with two variables. This is a unit on bivariate data. And just like the last time, instead of one big checkpoint at the end, we're going to do two smaller checkpoints along the way. So let's get into it. Categorical data. We'll be talking about categorical data. Now, let me try again. Categorical data is data that is not numbers. They're categories, like topics. Now, of course, we're in a math class. There will be numbers involved, but the numbers will not be the topic. So what we did in the previous unit is we found the average height of a basketball player, or we took a set of test scores and found the mean, the median, and mode, and talked about the spread and the variability and the standard deviation and all that stuff. Today, we're going to talk about data that's not number-based. Things like colors, color, favorite pet, how many pets you have, types of foods, things like that. Gender, boys versus girls, and your preference of cars. So all those things are not number-based, they're category-based. Bivariate, our bivariate data, our bivariate unit, means two variables for the data set. Two variables in the data set. So if you look at our first example, I'll explain how both of these things, the categorical data and the bivariate data, um, show up in our two-way frequency table. Our two-way frequency table means I have two categories. One category would be gender, and the other category would be vehicle type. So this survey that created this data would have to ask people, are you most identify with male or female? And then it would have to ask, would you prefer a sport utility vehicle or a sports car? So those would be the two questions that were asked in this survey. So our categories would be gender identification and vehicle type. The bivariate data is because we have two questions that were asked in our survey, so there's two different categories of answers. The two-way frequency table gives us a breakdown of the answers to our survey. So this first cell joins sport utility preference with gender identification of male, and there would be 25 people who identify as male and would choose a sport utility vehicle. So those two categories joined is why this 21 is called the joint frequency. Frequency is how many times that answer occurred, and the joint frequency means we are joining the gender identification as male and the sport utility vehicle preference. For the one next to it that has 39, this is joining the male gender identification with a sports car preference. So 39 people were male that chose a sports car. So those are called joint frequency because they're joining in two categories and telling the frequency of that combination. So we can keep going down here. There are 135 people who identified as female and wanted or preferred an SUV. And then the last box would be 45 people who identify as female and preferred a sports car. Along the margins of our box, these are the marginal frequencies. Those are the totals. So across this first row would be total of 60 people who identify as male. And the second row would be 180 people who identify female. Going down the first column, we would have 156 people prefer a SUV, and then 84 people prefer the sports car. So the totals add up across the rows and down the columns, And the final box in the lower left, lower right corner is the total people in the survey. So that's your total of totals. It's your total. So let's answer some basic questions. How many people responded to the survey? Well, that's our total, 240. How many males responded to the survey? So how many people totally, what was the total for people who identify as male? And that was our 60. So let's use purple, lighter purple. So that's 60. How many people chose an SUV? We were just talking about that. That's down here, the 156. How many females chose a sports car? So how many people that identify as female chose a sports car? That was 45. And how many those that identify as male chose an SUV? That was the 21. So that's how we read our frequency table. Okay. Now there's two types of frequencies that I just talked about. There is the joint frequency, and the joint frequency joins two categories and gives me the number of that combination of categories. That's the joint frequency. That's the number of responses from joining two categories. As far as our table is concerned, those are the inside cells. Our marginal frequency, that's the one that was out here, that's the frequency or how many totals for each category. That's outside the table, the outside row along the bottom and column along the side. So our margins, like the margins of your paper, are marginal frequencies around the outsides, and the joints frequency joining the two different categories together would be on the inside cells. So your inside cells add up to equal the marginal frequencies, sideways and vertically. Okay, so if you're ready, go ahead and see what you can do to fill in all the missing blanks about these 50 students in the 9th grade that were asked what kind of ice cream they like, vanilla or chocolate, and what kind of toppings they like, sprinkles, M&Ms, or nothing. So complete the table. Now, one thing that I like to do is I like to trace over the border line between the marginal and joint frequencies, separating the totals from my other numbers. It helps me visually keep separate which ones are totals and which ones are part of my data set. So remember, all these numbers have to add up across each row, and they have to add down for each column. So in order to find the blanks, you may have to do some adding, but you might also have to work backwards and do some subtracting. So I'm going to have you pause, fill in what you can, and then come back and we'll check to see how you did. So to get the number of sprinkles, vanilla sprinkles, we would do 16, subtract 7, meaning there's 9 left. That way 9 plus 7 would add up to 16. For M&Ms, the M&Ms column, you add up 9 and 8. So 8 plus 9 is 17. And then for the nothing column, 13 plus what number equals 17? So you do 17 minus 13 to get 4 here. And then the total for vanilla and chocolate has to add up to 50. So 50 minus 20 leaves 30 there. So now we can now we can teach Mr. Stewart how to talk, slow down, and answer some questions. There we go. How many ninth graders liked chocolate and no toppings? Join together the chocolate and no toppings, and how many were there? 4. Chocolate and no toppings. Is this joint or marginal? This should say marginal. And it is a joint frequency because we are joining together the love of chocolate with nothing else on it. So when you're combining those two categories, you are joining those two categories, making it a joint frequency. So we join two categories or two descriptions for that. All right, next one. How many ninth graders like vanilla and sprinkles? Vanilla and sprinkles. Again, joining two topics together, finding how many are vanilla and sprinkles, and that is 9. And that is, again, a joint frequency. Because we are joining the vanilla preference and the sprinkles preference into one. And then how many ninth graders like chocolate? Just straight up chocolate. So total chocolate is 20. That is our marginal frequency. So anytime they ask for marginal frequency, they're really just asking for the total for that particular topic. So that came in the margins of our table, around the outside of our table. It was a total, so that is a marginal frequency. Okay, so now let's do a bigger example, maybe a little more interesting. Over the last decade, superhero movies like the Avengers, X-Men, and things like that have become very popular. So high school students in the United States were invited to complete an online survey in the year 2010. Part of the survey included questions about superhero powers. More than 1,000 students responded to this survey that included a question about a student's most favorite superhero power. Out of the 1,000 students that responded, 450 of the completed surveys were randomly selected. A rather confusing breakdown of the data by gender was compiled from the 450 surveys. There were 1,000 surveys sent out, or over 1,000 surveys that were responded to, but as far as the information that we are analyzing, we are only going to analyze 450 randomly selected surveys from all that were turned in. So our total number of surveys for this question will be 450. So we know our total is 450. Now let's read each of these bullets. Let's see what we can fill in, and then we'll have to just figure out how to find the holes in whatever's left. So 100 students indicated their favorite power was to fly. 49 of those students were females. So to fly had 100 students total. 49 of those identified as female. Next bullet. 131 males, 131 students selected freeze time. So 131 chose freeze time. 71 of those identified as a male. All right, moving on. 75 students selected invisibility. 48 of those identified as female. And 26 students indicated super strength. 25 of those identified as male. 118 chose telepathy. That means being able to read minds. And 70 of those were female. So we are supposed to fill in all the rest of the blanks ourselves. So remember that the columns have to add up to our totals that are along the marginal frequency. And once we get those filled in, we can add across to fill in our rows and get our marginal frequency for the females and the marginal frequency for those who identify as male. So go ahead, pause, and fill in all the blanks. So hopefully you filled it in with the same numbers that I did. So how many students chose telepathy as their superpower? 118. It's right there. Total for telepathy was 118. What percent? Ooh, mixing it up a little bit here, aren't we? What percent of students chose telepathy as their superpower? Well, it was 118 students chose it out of 450 surveys that they looked at. So we do 118 that chose telepathy out of 450 surveys, and then multiply times 100 in order to make it a percent. When it says what percent, that means per 100. So you go to your calculator, push the buttons, 118 divided by 450 gives us that fraction. So what we want to do is get the decimal version. So instead of hitting enter, you can hit control and then enter. It'll give us the decimal. Then we'll do times 100 to convert that decimal into a percentage. And we are going to write our answer as 26.2%. So a quarter would be 25%, like 25 cents. So this is just over a quarter of the people would choose telepathy, the read minds, as their superpower. All right, part D. What is the marginal frequency for students who chose freeze time as their superpower? Marginal frequency for freeze time means, hey, how many students total picked freeze time as their favorite superpower? Well, freeze time has a total of 131. Give an example of a joint frequency. A joint frequency is when you join two categories together. So those who identify as female and want to fly would be 49. That is a joint frequency. Those who identify as male and choose super strength as their favorite power, that would be a joint frequency. So you can pick any one you want and write it in. How many males were surveyed? Well, how many total identified as a male? That's our marginal frequency for those identifying as males, which would be 222. Next question says, what percent of those identifying as males, percent of males, chose invisibility? So what percent of males chose invisibility? So males and invisibility is 27. So 27 out of the 222 males, what percent of males? We are focusing on just those that identify as male. So 27 shows invisibility out of the 222 that identify as male, and then making a percent times 100. So when you go to the calculator, you get 12.162162 repeating. And then to the nearest percent, approximately, this symbol means approximately 12%, because the 1 does not round the 2 up. Stays. Okay, so this is pretty easy, enjoyable. So what I want you to do is finish the practice. There's another table here about identifying as a male or a female, and then after school clubs, and then graduate or undergraduate college programs and majors. Some nice, fun, easy questions. So finish that practice, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye, good luck, and stay safe.